As a fun tangent related to what you were saying about Russian hacking, you had your release party at KGB Bar in New York City. Yeah. That's a nice bar. I like that place. It's kind of like a glimpse of old school New York City.
Oh, I love it. Yeah, well, it's a very voice bar. Mark Jacobson, one of the writers, he does a monthly writing thing there. So it was pretty easy to hook up. It was too small. And what's so funny is I picked the top floor rather than the middle floor or
Mhm.
the main bar because they had a lot of seating and everybody's old, right? So,
Yeah.
they're all in their 70s and older. Like a lot of people were in their 70s and older and thinking like, oh, there'll be more seating so they could sit down. None of them sat down. They all just stood up
Mhm.
and yelled at each other for like hours, I should have done I mean, we should have done like the whole space, but
Mhm.
mm.
Good choice. Yo, welcome to My Summer Lair. I'm your host, Sammy. I'm smart enough to know it takes a village to raise a village idiot, Younan. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when I say the Village Voice? Often called America's greatest alternative weekly newspaper, the Village Voice has a 50 years plus history. The Village Voice was launched and founded by Ed Fancher, Dan Wolfe, and of course, Norman Mailer on October 26, 1955. By the time the Village Voice reached the 1960s, it was entering its golden era, which would run well into the 90s, definitely covering music, film, local politics, national politics, books, and the art world. In short, many of the combustible elements that make New York City so great. What's the first thing that comes to your mind when I say the Village Voice? For me, it's New York City, yo. That third world energy, that hustle, that grind, and all that glorious pop culture. Yes! You're about to meet and hear from Tricia Romano, who assembled an oral history of the Village Voice. Over 200 former Village Voice writers, staffers, and editors, they all reflected on their work and their experiences. And because it's an oral history, her book, The Freaks Come Out to Write, captures all the charming chaos of writing and working at the Village Voice. As Tricia says to me, for almost everyone that was there at the Village Voice, it was the best part of their career and the best part of their life. It's cool, man. The Freaks Come Out to Write is organized chronologically, so you can read about the Village Voice's reactions to spontaneous historical movements that would have butterfly effects far beyond New York City. The women's movement, feminism, Stonewall and gay rights, the birth of early hip hop. Shout out to DJ Kool Herc. Spike Lee to Donald Trump, both are synonymous with New York City, for good and for bad. The war against gentrification, which sometimes is a losing war. Tricia Romano started at The Voice as an intern and wound up writing columns on New York nightlife. I so appreciate a theme that runs through this conversation is celebrating characters. If you've ever been to New York City, you know exactly what I mean about characters. Just really weird, yet really cool people. Characters wrote at The Village Voice. Characters read The Village Voice. Tricia encountered characters covering nightlife. Characters are why you put on pants and you want to travel and go to new places. You want to see new weirdos, fresh characters. You know, one person who's always been a special character is Stephanie, and she's got the introduction for this episode where Tricia and I unpack the powerful and magical history of the Village Voice. Hit it!
Sound, the final frontier. My Summer Lair is an enterprise, a pop culture voyage with a continuing mission to explore strange new worlds, to seek out new creators and celebrate established producers, to boldly go where no podcast has gone before. And now here is your host, Sammy Younan.
I just want to pick up on that thread of what you're talking about with like KGB Bar, like, and even I guess running through your book too is like, is mourning a perpetual New York City emotion? Like, running through your book is like CBGBs and punk scenes and off Broadway, and just this cultural vibrancy that slowly gentrified out of many neighborhoods in New York City. So is mourning like almost like a New York City emotion, like a grief that you just kind of carry with you as you wander through the boroughs?
I feel like that's true. I also feel like that's true of other cities as well. Like we just don't. It's just not as it's not as recorded, right? Like all the media is in New York.
Mm-hmm.
And so New York's importance and movements get amplified and magnified to the world. And it was being amplified and magnified during a time frame when it was just really, really exciting. But like I live in Seattle and there's definitely a mourning over what Seattle was in just, the 90s. And for the people in the 90s, there was a mourning that Seattle had changed drastically since the 70s.
Mm-hmm.
I think any major city where there's like money coming in and displacing interesting art and culture and people that create and want to go to that art and culture, there's a constant grieving of what there was and why you moved there and how it's not that place anymore.
Mm-hmm.
There's almost nothing we can do about it. But
it almost becomes risk averse. Like it doesn't feel dangerous. Like dangerous in the sense of like anything could happen tonight. We could see a cool band. We could see something. You know what I mean? You want those cultural surprises.
Yeah, I mean, that's a thing. Yeah, I think part of it. Well, Ada Calhoun, you know her.
Mm-hmm. Yeah.
She wrote St. Mark's is Dead.
Yeah.
Yeah, St. Mark's is Dead. And she writes about this phenomenon a little bit in her book where everybody is always saying it was better before. And a lot of it has to do with like being in your 20s. And that's when you're like discovering things.
Mm-hmm.
And, I don't know. Like, I know New York is not what it was in the 90s or before that. But when I visit now, it still has an electricity that is totally missing from Seattle.
Mm-hmm.
And because it just has so much energy, like that vibrancy of just so many people striving and
hustle.
Yeah, the hustle.
Mm-hmm.
And also, just I don't know, like the what's the word? Just the la vida loca. I mean, like they just want to live like out loud and in public. And I still feel like there's a lot of creative stuff going on. But part of the reason why it feels like it's dead is because so much has already been done.
Mm-hmm.
Like a lot of it is like redoing what has been done. Because back in the 70s or 80s, like it was all like music, everything was new, right? And now I feel like we're just kind of recycling a lot of stuff, even the sounds that are being used in music. Like it's not, it's like it's almost like we've hit the end. Like infinity, infinity is not a thing.
Yeah.
But I don't know. I also I just think I'm young and I'm not young anymore, and so I'm probably out of the loop.
Mm-hmm.
Like there's something going on right now that you and I don't know about.
Yeah. But I mean, it reflects, circling back to the Village Voice in your book, The Freaks Came Out to Write. Early Village Voice covered like the beginning of hip hop, some of the gay rights movement, feminism. These were like new movements and they hadn't really had a voice or identity yet, right? Like we didn't know what this thing could be. And so that's what part of what you're talking about is like that kind of excitement where like this is happening, like hip hop is happening or feminism is happening. Like what does this mean and how is this going to shape things? And like look at all these sounds and all these people and cool characters coming out of this movement.
Right. Yeah. I mean, the voice still exists in a very strange way. And I don't know. I don't know that you're seeing any of that reflected in this time frame.
Mm-hmm.
But the voice was the thing about the voice that was different than a lot of the other media at that time and all the newspapers or whatever is that they were very open to anybody that would walk into the door and say, I want to write about this. Whereas like, a place like the New York Times was very, very closed, or any of the other legacy media, they would be very close. And so it would be almost impossible for someone to come in off the street and say, there's this feminist movement going on that I want to write about. Like, by the time it trickled up to the New York Times, it was probably like half over.
Mm-hmm.
And, so that was one of the sort of superpowers of The Voice, is that anybody could come in and say, there's this thing going on that I saw up in Harlem, and you got to know about it. And it is so cool. It's called hip hop. And, the editor might be kind of incredulous, but they might say, just, okay, I'll do it on spec. Let's see what you got.
Mm-hmm.
And then, once it becomes more established, or they start hearing from other writers about it, then they know, okay, there's something to this. And, at that time, sales would indicate whether or not they are onto something.
Mm-hmm.
Because if nobody else is covering something, you're the only one to, write about hip hop or to write about any of that stuff, then, people are going to pick up that paper.
Yeah.
And I think that happened for feminism, that happened for hip hop, that happened for when Mary Nichols was writing about the village and trying to save Washington Square Park from being bulldozed.
Moses.
All those, from Moses, that all that stuff made The Voice like must read, because nobody else is really doing it.
But does that first person journalism, like you said, I'm from hip hop, so I'm going to write about hip hop. I'm involved in feminism. I support feminism, ladies' rights, all these kind of things. Does that first person journalism, does that create a natural tension with objectivity? As you said, it's completely different. Like the qualification to write for the Village Voice was basically, as your title suggests, being a freak or weird, right?
Yeah. I mean, we never believed in objectivity. And I think that objectivity is sort of a false idea in the first place in journalism, is kind of how we ended up with Donald Trump, because so many people are in media, and you're seeing it right now, bending over backward to make it seem like they don't think that this person is completely insane and has no business being there.
Mm-hmm.
So they treat him with like legitimacy and care, and then they like over criticize the other person to make it seem like it's both sides, and it's just not, that's not the truth.
Mm-hmm.
And just because you're not objective doesn't mean you're not telling the truth. It's like objectivity is like, what's the old saw? Like, it's raining outside, and an objective newspaper would say, so and so said it wasn't raining outside, and you can just go look outside and see that it's raining.
Mm-hmm.
But the other person said, the weatherman said, it is raining outside. You don't need to report the fact that that's not true,
mm-hmm.
just to show, equality. And so I think the thing about The Voice also is having people who were on the ground, and who, what they were writing about was in some ways their passion, made them connect so much more with the art or the culture or the thing that they were covering, and they gave it an urgency that you didn't see elsewhere.
It's an urgency, but also an authenticity, right? Because what you're talking about is like way before all the Marvel movies came out. Nerds used to write about nerd stuff, right? Used to write about comic books, Star Trek. They tried to save Star Trek. But when it's a nerd like that, or a Trekkie, or somebody involved in that realm, they're able to articulate that, and like you can see the authenticity coming from them, right? And when somebody's not from that world, right?
Yeah. You can always,
mm-hmm.
Yeah. I think the other thing that The Voice, I mean, some people would criticize it for this, but it could almost be like a little exclusionary to people who were already part of that. So, sometimes the lingo or the closeness with that subject would be just, your audience would be, your perceived audience would be people you knew were already interested in this.
Shorthand.
Versus telling a lot of people outside
Mhm.
that, there's this thing, like, this is it's a different angle. Like, when I wrote my column, the nightlife column, I did not explain who everyone was because I assumed my audience knew who everyone was. And that can be a little alienating for some readers, but for other readers, it'd be like getting a window into a world that they weren't part of. Like, what's really cool? Okay, let's read this thing. And who are these people? Oh, this is fascinating. But if you're writing for a larger, more mainstream paper, you're kind of doing the work for the reader and like telling them, like laying it all out for them in a very on a platter. You're not assuming that they already know something. So it's a different approach, and one that I think can sometimes be alienating, but also one that I think is more authentic, like you said.
Yeah, this is a short tangent, but I was recently watching Family Ties, the old sitcom, and there was a family member that came and visited the family, and she was saying that she along the way that she stayed at a bed and breakfast. And so Michael J. Fox had to explain to Mallory, and I guess to the audience as well, what a bed and breakfast was. Right? So I guess the audience in 1987, TV audience in 1987, didn't know what a bed and breakfast was. And it wasn't like he made a joke. He actually explained what it was. You know what I mean? So it was like this weird moment of media literacy. I'm like, nobody knew what a bed and breakfast was in 1987. That's when the episode aired, and I was just surprised. But this urgency and this passion that you're talking about, does that also, I guess, as a dark underbelly, does that lead into like ego and territory and I guess kind of like this is my domain in terms of like
To some degree, yeah. I mean, in some degree, I think, like one of the things that happened when I got the column, the larger column, I did Fly Life, which was like more like a gossipy column. They brought us in, the editors brought us in and said, "We want you to write this column." And they pointed to Rebecca's column. I'm completely blanking on her last name. She did a column in the OC Weekly called Commie Girl, where she went to events and she quoted people and wrote about the event. And it was mostly political stuff that she did, but they wanted me to do it for nightclubs. And that me and my then co-columnist was like, "This is like Michael Mosso's column. Did you tell Michael Mosso that you want to add another nightlife column?" And they were like, "No." Like, it didn't even occur to them, like how big of a like overstep that could be. And so we went to him and we like cleared it with him and talked to him. And I was very cognizant. Like, there was some overlap between us. And I don't know how he felt about me, but I always respected what he did. And I just made sure that I wasn't doing too much. And sometimes we'd be at the same event and, there would be a mention of it. But if I knew he was going to cover something like heavily, like I usually would back off a little bit. But yeah, it creates, I mean, writers are already ego driven narcissists. I mean, like,
the book has a lot of that too. Right? Like like Stanley Crouch as an example, right? Like just always kind of
all of them.
Yeah,
All of
fighting.
them. I mean, they want like, if you're going to put your name out there and in your opinion, or you're going to tell people that you should be paying attention, they should be paying attention to what you have to say. You have to have a certain amount of ego. It's just what it is. So, and The Voice, because it was so individualistic, was a collection of amazing egos. And, rightfully so, they were all pretty fucking smart. I mean, I don't think there was a single idiot. I think talking to everybody, they all had such different perspectives and such, some of their backgrounds were very similar. Some of them were very different, and they really, I think the thing that I think Richard Goldstein said, the conflict was that you were living your beat. So like your thing was so important to you. Like, you couldn't see why it was just as important as the thing that the other person was writing about. Like, there was just this, kind of like
blind spot.
You're siloed.
Yeah. Well, and also those limited space on the cover too. right? So even though you feel your thing is important, or gay rights or feminism, as I alluded to already, like those are big issues and big topics, especially as New York went through those changes in the 70s and 80s. Like, but there's only limited space on the cover, right? So again, that's where the ego kind of starts to come in, and that tension, because everyone wants to end up on the cover.
Yeah, and people forget about that. The internet, like, you don't fight for space. There's no there's no limit.
Right.
And then when you make the front page or whatever the website, you screenshot it because an hour later it's going to be gone. It's so ephemeral and constantly moving. Whereas like a print cover is like forever, and there is a permanency to that. And even then, like the voice, like the news journalism has always been very, biased towards hard news, investigative news. And that tends to be a very white male world. And that created a lot of conflict because The Voice was not really a white male place and by the 80s, especially, in the beginning it was, because that's just what everybody, it's like the 50s, coming out of the 50s, there were only a handful of women and no Black people, except for, I think, later Carmen. But it was a very, that tension between news and arts has always been there. And in almost every publication that I've ever been at, like, even like in a micro way, or is it macro? Spin Magazine, for instance, like there was a difference between the feature writers, the critics. Like there was just this kind of tension between them.
A parallel to what you're talking about is like biopics versus a documentary, right? So you can do a Freddie Mercury biopic and maybe take certain liberties or like overlook certain things. You don't have to have that same quote unquote rigorous journalism. Whereas if you're doing a documentary, there's kind of an underlying belief that like you've researched and you talk to people. Like you can't just like make up stuff or just kind of gloss over certain things because it doesn't fit with this scene, right? But again, like in a biopic, if you don't want to include a certain scene, you could just drop it, and then that way the story flows better or moves.
Yeah, right.
Right. So that kind of freedom you're talking about.
Yeah. Sorry, I don't.
No. I'm just paralleling what you're saying. And so what I find interesting is, like you said, the different voices, because your book is an oral history, and it features comments from like Bob Costas, Nelson George, Bruce Springsteen's drummer Max Weinberg, Norman Mailer, who was one of the founders. Like these people have never been in the same room together, but the Village Voice brought these quote unquote weirdos or these freaks together. Right. And that's like interesting as a cultural magnet. As you said, there wasn't a lot of time or space at the beginning in the 50s for like women writers or Black writers, whatever. But as it started to grow, it started to become this kind of cultural magnet to harness these weirdos.
Yeah, I think, especially it being so unique at the time when it was, first started, people that read it, they never read anything like it. And if they recognized some of the obscure stuff that they were covered, they were even more attracted to it. And it sort of symbolized some things, like I think Mark Jacobson has a quote about how like they would carry it under their arm because it was like at high school, because it was like the cool paper, like keeping it like teeny and I think that also went a long ways in its branding. Like it just had that strong brand. But the other thing about like having all these personalities under one roof, it's like Richard Goldstein says something about how they would never be at a party together.
Yeah.
But I mean, they would. I think that's not true. But I do think one of the reasons why The Voice is and the book is so, I think it's doing well and is successful in the sense that it collects all those people. Whereas, like, there are a lot of like memoirs from Voice people, and they're really interesting reads. But there's something about all of those voices together that becomes more powerful, more exciting than just one of those people on their own. because it is just about that collection. It's an alchemy that they all created.
Yeah, you already touched upon the first person journalism, and anyone can come in and write. That's one of the aspirational threads that runs through your book. But the other one is that a lot of the characters that we're talking about, a lot of these people, like I mentioned, Nelson George, for example, right? Like they went on to also create culture, not just write about culture, right? Like, which is a different thread again. Like, he helped finance Spike Lee's debut feature, She's Gotta Have It. Like, and then that gave us like Spike Lee, right? Like, so then it's just like you have the story of Max Weinberg in the book where he says the Village Voice changed my life. You can share that story, but like Nelson George though, like Max's experience would go on to change our lives as well. So it wasn't just them writing about culture, connecting with culture. It would have this ripple effect in the same way. It's completely different than when you read something in the New York Times about a movie review or something. And you're like, that's nice. And then that person would go on to write another movie review and you go take a nap, right? Like,
well, it was very, symbiotic, right? Like it's a two-way street, whereas most, I think, journalism and media is a one-way street. Here's the thing I'm going to tell you about. And that's part of like, that goes back to you're part of the world that you're covering. It's like no one said to Nelson, you can't write about Spike Lee because you financed this thing. It was just like we weren't writing about stuff if we didn't believe in it. That's not to say you couldn't be critical. And I think that's like you could definitely be critical, but I think like they were writing about stuff that they cared about. And some of that meant that they were part of the world that they were covering. And, I think Lisa Jones said something about like she was in a theater group at that time. So was Jane Hannam. He's a novelist now, and he was part of a theater group. And, another theater editor was Brian Parks, and he was he did directing and playwriting. These were all creative people that were a part of the universe they were covering. And, that makes it more alive and also more interactive. And like, yeah, like the voice, with Nelson, it's just like crazy to think about how connected the voice was to Spike Lee on like multiple levels. And when Spike Lee won his Oscar finally, I was like, it was like a cousin of the Village Voice, winning an Oscar, because he was really, we are the paper that gave him all that press in the very beginning of his career. First, Carol Cooper was the first person to write about him.
As you said, the book is doing well. And I'm curious, like, even when you've done interviews or you've talked to people and you mentioned, like, you've done this book, The Freaks Come Out to Write, this Village Voice book, it's an oral history. Like, what kind of emotions, can you sum up somehow even the emotions that people have when you bring up the Village Voice? Because it's a lot different. People don't necessarily have like Washington Post emotions or Wall Street Journal emotions. But when you talk to people or you do interviews and you bring up the Village Voice, can you sum up some of the emotions that they have? Because it's a distinct.
I mean, most of it is just pure fondness and nostalgia, like and wistfulness that it's not, like it for almost everyone that was there, it was the best part of their career and the best part of their life. And some of that could be attributed being like in your 20s, right? But some of those people were there for a really long time and then left and went to, other papers, magazines, or went and did something else. But almost everyone, I would say, looks upon it very with fondness and love. Some people had negative experiences, still have some level of PTSD from it. and like, I have a friend who, like, I don't think she read the whole book because it started to stress her out because she was like laid off during one of the big layoffs. And, there are some things that like, because it was so intense there, you take some of the things that happened to you there personally. And you never kind of move on from it. And I think that's what I've seen some people, but mostly, even when they're recounting their feuds, they're very like, fond of those feuds.
That's the thing. Like, that's one of the themes that runs through the whole book is everybody's a character. Yeah, like it was disappointing in a way that it wasn't a documentary because it's like, I would like to hear this guy's voice in person, like just the way.
Oh, I mean,
Yeah.
I did a few little videos where it combined all those, and I actually thought maybe they should do an audiobook that uses these clips, but we're working on a documentary, I should say. We're trying to get one off the ground. But the one of the things I used to do when I first got to The Voice, we had a smoking room in 1997. We still had a smoking room. It's just like tiny little glassed in office right across from the fact checking people and from Doug Simmons's office. It was crazy to think about. And some of us would just sit in there all day and do our work. You know, we were going to be printing out stuff and fact checking stuff, and and one of my friends, Nita, and I would sit there and go through the whole building, be like, playing like, who's normal? Is there anybody normal in this building?
Yeah.
And we'd like name up everyone. Nope. 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 He's weird. Nope. Definitely weirdo. Definitely not normal. Like there is just not one like normal person in the whole building. And that's kind of what made it great. I don't know, like I've been at other places that are a lot more straight, and I just didn't feel very I didn't feel like myself there.
Normal can be boring. Kind of what you're talking about too is like Saturday Night Live as another cultural magnet, right? Like I think there's an entire generation of people that don't realize that Bill Murray and Eddie Murphy and even like Martin Short were on SNL, right? They've been off the air for so long, right? They haven't been part of that cast. But when you go, especially those early like 70s and 80s and even to the 90s of SNL, like those are like weird people. They're characters and they're freaks and they have different perspectives, right?
I mean,
so I can imagine it's a very similar environment.
Yeah, definitely. And also, like the new SNL isn't quite as wacky as the old SNL. Like there's definitely still weirdos there, but if you compare the first cast to the cast now, not even
true.
Like very far apart, right? Who's what's his Scarlett Johansson's husband? What's his name?
Which characters does he do? Which one are you thinking of?
He does the news report.
Oh, yeah. I know that dude you're talking about. Yeah. I'm drawing a blank on his name. But yeah. The white dude, right? Like
that guy.
Yeah, that guy, yeah.
He would never have been part of 1970s SNL.
No, he wouldn't have lasted. No.
They would have beat him up like in the hallway.
But again, that would have ended up in the oral history though, right? Like I already mentioned like Stanley Crouch like fisticuffs in the hallway, right? In the offices.
Yeah.
So
he wanted to intimidate everybody through his physicality. But but he was also like, it overshadows, I think that some of that overshadows his brilliance as a writer and his combativeness in his prose was there too. He was always taking unorthodox positions.
Like hip hop, for example.
Yeah, exactly. And I think that would just not be tolerated now. I feel like you'd have to be siloed into a different pop publication, like you see so-called like Reason magazine or Chillette or whatever. Like they had to like go off into their own zone in order to criticize the left from within the left or from the center. Now, Voice, everybody's here. Fight amongst yourselves.
Yeah. Well, I think that's also interesting too, because you would get like Stanley Crouch saying like, I'm not being as eloquent as he is, but like hip hop's terrible or it sucks or it's bad for black people or whatever his positions are. And then you would have Nelson George like, this new thing's coming up and it's amazing, right? Like that tension between those things is interesting because I think that's where sometimes the silos come in effect, the way we consume culture now, right? We're like, you're quote unquote like a Fox News viewer for almost everything, right? Like you don't want a lot of dissent. You want to just kind of like have your own opinions reinforced, right? Rather than something new.
Yes. Because it's like, the anxiety that somebody disagreeing with you now has a different kind of feeling,
Mm-hmm.
you know. But, they have that issue with like Nat Hentoff, the civil rights writer who was a libertarian in the old school way, and he was a civil libertarian, and he was very against the death penalty. And so he became anti-abortion. And like, while he was righteous on all these other issues, the feminists and a lot of the people, almost everybody at the paper was livid that he would get on there and talk about being anti-abortion.
Mm-hmm.
They were livid. They couldn't believe this was happening in the Village Voice. But then it's like, what are you going to do? Censor the civil libertarian who writes about civil rights and free, free.
Yeah. Well, but it also just shows the complexity to people. Like, it's not like we have these terms like Republican and Democrat and like libertarian, like you just said.
Mhm,
Like, there is a set of values, even just nerd, as I mentioned before. There's a set of
mhm,
values or a shorthand that we kind of operate with. But within that,
mhm.
there's still complexity because people are not one thing, right? So they can throw you a curve. Like, you can like fight for women and things like that, but then there's other people who are like, no, I don't like gay marriage. You know what I mean? Like, how could you be like
Mhm.
for that one thing and then against this other thing? You know?
Yeah, I mean, Matt Hentoff, when you really looked at his philosophy or his belief system, it was consistent.
Mm-hmm.
Like, he believed in, if he didn't believe in the death penalty, he believed that life should be protected. It was like a kind of stubborn, rigid through line through how he looked at the world. And he couldn't comport like, well, if I'm against the death penalty, how can I be for people willingly killing, you know, who he thought were babies? And or, he got there because of Terry Schiavo, the woman who was on life support,
Mm-hmm.
and the family wanted to end it, and he didn't think that wasn't their choice. So he, like, today, I'm sure he would be like not at all into the euthanasia movement, the self people saying I want to die, I don't want to before I get like completely
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember my own name, or I can't walk, or I need to be assisted. He would, he would be against that completely, you know. So there was a logic to his complexity.
Yeah. I think that sometimes is overlooked too when we talk about being siloed. You're kind of just looking for more of the simplicity. We kind of yearn for more simplicity than accept complexity, right?
Right, yeah.
And so circling back to you, you already alluded to it, but you were a Village Voice writer. Was that always an aspiration for you? Was that a place you wanted to go and write, or was that just a journalism job for clips kind of thing?
No, what's interesting is I didn't really know about the Village Voice and like a railway until I was in college in Seattle, because I grew up in Las Vegas and partially New Jersey, but mostly Las Vegas. And there was no sort of alt culture there until like the 90s. And so I don't think I even saw the Village Voice. I was an avid reader of Spin and Rolling Stone, and I always wanted to write for them. And then when I was in college, we had a newsstand around the corner from my house, and it had the Village Voice. And I started picking that up, either because I had heard of it or I don't remember exactly, but I remember buying it from the newsstand and thinking it was the coolest. And then another friend of mine had at university, had gotten an internship there and went out for summer, and when Williamsburg was just a block, and she came
Mm-hmm.
back just so excited. And she had like a big picture, like double page spread, like printed, and like she just sort of put the idea that it was a cool thing to do, because she also, unlike most internships, was taking photos, like actually having real impact inside the paper. And that was like very different. Like, I applied to 3 internships, and I remember Spin Magazine, New Yorker, and The Voice. And the New Yorker, they wanted me to work in the advertising or marketing side, publicity side for 40 hours with no pay.
Wow.
So I wouldn't, even have a chance to write for the paper. Like, it was just useless. And then the other one was Spin, and they were like 20 hours a week, and you'll just be fetching copy and opening mail, and you don't get to write. Like, they were very clear, like, there's no writing. And then The Voice was like, oh yeah, people write cover stories sometimes when they're interns, and you just come in, do your 10 hours, blah blah blah, and then you could like maybe become like a fact checker or copy editor, pick up some hours here and get paid. And I was like, well, this is clearly I'm going there. You know what I
Yeah.
mean? And I ended up sharing a cover story and writing for the paper, and like I get picked up proofreading gigs, like all that stuff. It was just much more fluid and open.
You touched upon it already, but can you just expand a little bit? What was your beat, or what were you writing about at the Village Voice?
I was a nightlife columnist, which is, I wrote about techno and dance music, clubs, and, just like club culture. I covered a lot about like the burlesque renaissance that was happening at that time. Murray Hill, who is now a famous actor on an HBO show, was, always around, and I was a regular in my column for many years, and then I would write feature stories, kind of spinning off some of that stuff. I did a story about what we called the sober hipsters, basically people in nightlife who DJs, promoters, club employees, the performers, whatnot, that had gotten sober or were already sober and worked in this industry that was filled with drugs and alcohol, and how they did it. And Murray was in that story, and so is Larry T, who did the song "Supermodel." You better work for RuPaul, that has since moved on, and Tommy Sunshine, another DJ, the world famous Bob, who is a burlesque fixture, and so I would write stuff about like just the culture or in general, like what was happening in clubs and nightlife, and profile the people.
Characters again. That's kind of again
All characters.
yeah, again the New York City thread, right? Not just with the Village Voice, which attracted a lot of characters, but like what I was saying before with like mourning and like grieving a little bit in New York City, where like it's also not just the absence of like CBGBs and the death of those kind of places, but it's also like you also worry about the characters, right? Because you want to like
Yeah, I mean,
go out in New York City and encounter characters.
they're still there for
Mhm.
sure. A lot of them are older, probably, because they're the ones that can have the rent stabilized and rent control apartments, because you can never leave. But I do like wonder, like, especially with the TikTok, it's like, I don't know how you say it, TikTokification of New York City. Who is able to move there and afford $3,000, like one bedroom? Like, what are you doing for a living? Mommy is paying for it? Is it
Mhm.
a marketing job for some tech company? Like, those people are here in Seattle, and they are the dullest group of people you've ever seen. Like,
Mm.
just, they don't, their life is consumption, food, you know, tech consumption. Like, they're boring, and they don't go to theater. They don't go to music. They go to bars and spend $20 on a cocktail. You know, and I think that New York is the same at this point. But there's always going to be some characters being drawn to New York because of New York's legacy. Because everyone wants to everyone wants to read Just Kids and then try and recreate that.
The Patti
You
Smith.
know what I mean?
Yeah.
Like,
Mhm.
and, and, like my book, like they're gonna read that and go, God, I want to have a experience like that. And they still come for
Mhm.
that reason, even if it's not quite there the way they imagined it.
It's
But
kind of
some 20-year-old is trying to recreate it.
Yeah, it circles back to what you were saying before about your internships and like you could work for Spin and like do photocopy and like get coffee or whatever, or you could work at the Village Voice and maybe do a cover story and like write articles and do these kind of things. And that's kind of why people go to New York City, because it's like everywhere else you can just photocopy and get coffee, but New York City is that promise and that illusion of that, like that if you hustle, you could end up like writing a cover story or like, right, like.
Yeah, so the city still has that feeling like something exciting could happen any minute.
Mm-hmm.
It still has that feeling. I mean, like I had like drinks with Al Gore twice in New York, and like there's just no universe where that's gonna happen in Seattle.
Yeah.
Like I can't even give you one anecdote like that in all my years in Seattle. It's just it's still there. It's still got some mojo.
Mm-hmm.
It's never going to be what it was, but I'm sure the bohemians and the beats of the 50s and 60s were opining that it wasn't what Greenwich Village was in the 20s and 30s. Like or the turn of the century, like
Mm-hmm.
that New York bohemia is longer than when we were just it stretches beyond
Yeah.
what our memories are, right?
And so just to end this conversation then, like I noticed a lot of reactions to your book also focus on the demise of the alt weeklies and that whole like alternative sources. We were kind of even touched upon that as well, just kind of getting some different voices and different perspectives and just kind of seeing culturally what's out there. But I've also found a fascinating reaction to your book, The Freaks Come Out to Write, is how much people on Substack write about it. In a way, like Substack has become like a Village Voice, right? Like it's just a lot of characters and a lot of different stories. And as we were saying before, a lot of different perspectives. Where like somebody's like for abortion and somebody's against abortion. Like you get all these different perspectives. It's not as necessarily cohesive as the Village Voice, where you pick it up and there's a cover story and all that. But Substack kind of mirrors a lot of that kind of Village Voice energy.
Yeah, I mean to some degree, but it's not curated. It's like like it would be if some editor was or collection of editors was like, let me curate you like this group of people that have totally different ideas and under one roof. I mean, you have to search those people out instead of Substack and kind of create your own little list. But yeah, there's a bunch of voice writers there. Lucian Truscott's there, Laurie Stone is there. I'm sure forgetting some others, but there's a bunch of voice writers that are Substack. Oh, Robert Christgau, the music critic, he's there. There's just tons of people out there that are from The Voice that you can go pay and read and support. And I think that it's the only other place. The difference is that it's not curated.
Yeah.
And that curation or the editing of voices and creating this collection is what gave The Voice power.
And so the book is called The Freaks Come Out to Write, and it's oral history of the Village Voice. So it's pretty fascinating, and it covers obviously from the beginning with Norman Mailer as one of the founders, right up to 2000s, post 2000s, like just of course throughout New York City too. So that includes like gay rights movement. We touched upon feminism. Donald Trump, of course, you get a chapter or two in the book as well.
Yeah.
Right. Because again, like you were saying before with Spike Lee, that was some of the earliest writing, and some of the earliest writing on Trump was from the Village Voice. So
the biggest, early, they had this number very, very early, and Wayne Barrett had his number. Like Wayne Barrett, reporter, he knew that Trump was a con man so early, and knew he was a racist so early, and that playbook is never.
I mean, it makes sense because Village Voice was also writing about like slumlords and corrupt judges and things like that. So it had that spider sense, right? Attuned for corruption. And we even touched upon authenticity too. So when people are writing in the Village Voice from an authentic perspective, you can also see when somebody's fake or, like you said, a con man.
Yep.
Yeah, so the freaks come out to write. Thank you so much for like hanging out. We covered a lot actually, like New York City and
Thank you.
Seattle and like Substack and like Stanley Krauss fighting in the
All of it.
hallways and Nelson George and Spike Lee. Like,
I love Nelson.
yeah.
Yeah. So, well, thank you for having me.
Yes.
For promoting the book.
No, it's a great job. So high five. I know it's not easy to do an oral history like this. So you survived as well. So high five to you for surviving a project like this.
Thank you.
Yo, that was Tricia, and her book is The Freaks Come Out to Write, The Definitive History of the Village Voice, the Radical Paper That Changed American Culture. That's not hyperbole either. It's out now, and I'm Sammy, host of My Summer Lair. Man, there's only a handful of truly legendary outlaw media outlets. Early Rolling Stone magazine, that was edgy, for lack of a better term. It was edgy for like a couple of decades, some good decades. Cream magazine, and of course, The Village Voice. They were all incredibly and gloriously anti-suburb. Man, sooner or later, we all grow up, we pay a hard mortgage, and we just end up reading the New York Times. But man, it's always fun to wander down a dark, graffiti-covered alleyway and see and discover if an unmarked door will open and reveal something spectacular. Village Voice was a bright flashlight when you wandered down that dark alley. Sometimes it was the reason why you were in a dark alley. I suspect our culture is currently struggling because our counterculture just isn't as strong or as bold. When you read The Freaks Come Out to Write, there was clearly two distinct New York cities. The surface world, with Wall Street and landlords, that's the day shift. And then there was the nightlight, night town, often underground like the best subways. And just like the subways, they could take you to magical places. I closed this conversation with Tricia talking about Substack. I made that observation about Substack because I'm on Substack. My Pal Sammy is my handy dandy newsletter. My Pal Sammy is a weekly pop culture extravaganza covering many of the delicious pop culture elements that made the Village Voice so tasty. Films and books and TV shows and so much more. From passion to hashtag pantsworthy. It's all happening. Sign up today by Googling My Pal Sammy. Sign up today, and I promise, I'll give you 2 thumbs up. Thank you for listening to me in the Netflix world. The Village Voice, yo.